Revolutionary War, the Continental Congress promised a monthly lifetime income to soldiers who fought and survived the conflict. This guaranteed income stream, called a pension, was again offered to soldiers in the Civil War and every American war since, right? So this is how governments work. They will take from the taxpayer in order to have you fight for their right to take things from the taxpayer, and you get much less than what they take. It's a pretty nasty shakedown scheme. The article says, since then, similar pension promises funded from public coffers expanded to cover retirees from other branches of government. States and cities followed suit, extending pensions to all sorts of municipal workers, ranging from policemen to politicians, teachers to trash collectors. Now, a pension is what's referred to as a defined benefit plan. The payout promised to a worker upon retirement is guaranteed up front according to a formula typically dependent on salary size and years of employment. And so the government started offering this stuff, and guaranteed income is a myth. Guaranteed investment income is a myth, or rather, it's a lie that is enforced by the power of the state to steal from others, in particular the unborn, because remember, taxation without representation, totally wrong unless you're still a gleam in your daddy's eye. So what happened was the government began offering these massive pensions with guaranteed payouts. So, of course, that drew more and more people to government work, and so the private sector had to start offering them as well. The first corporate pension offered by the American Express Company in 1875. By the 1960s, half of all employees in the private sector were covered by a pension plan. But why? Why should the government or a company pay for your pension? They don't pay usually for your squash club membership. They don't pay for your shoes. Now, of course, they pay for your health care, but that comes out of the Second World War when companies weren't allowed to give raises to their employees or potential employees. So in order to retain talent, they simply said, well, we'll pay for your health insurance instead. So once pensions become commonplace, they're much less effective in order to get the top talent. They just become burdensome and horrible to companies. As America's corporations grew and their veteran employees started hitting retirement age, the amount of funding required to meet current and future pension funding obligations became huge. And of course, this is all based on the boomer generation, the largest ever generation by far in U.S. history. And the boomers, remember, another product of war. The reason why, of course, the men went away to fight. They came back. They had like 5 kids apiece back when taxes were lower and there was kind of a free market still. You could have one guy going to work for 40 hours a week and able to afford a house, a car, a wife, 5 kids. Boy, can you imagine? Hasn't immigration been great? So companies wanted to get this liability off their backs. And some firms began defaulting, like unable to pay their pensions. And so in the 70s and 80s, there were personal retirement saving plans introduced. There was the IRA, the Individual Retirement Arrangement, in 1974, 401k in 1980. In Canada, they're called Registered Retirement Savings Plans, or RRSPs, and so on. They're defined contribution plans. So it means that you can shelter your money from the tax man by putting it into a retirement plan, but there's no guarantee of how much is actually going to be paid out. In other words, it's based upon the market. And so, yeah, if your company doesn't offer a pension, yeah, you can open your RSP, your IRA, create your own personal pension fund. And if you think that the company might go bankrupt or might mismanage your pension fund or might invest in things you don't like, you can take it over yourself with your 401k plan. And if you want to retire sooner, you can just crank up your income contributions every year. And, pretty good for employees, but great for employers because it means that they don't have to pay for these massive pension plans anymore. And so corporate America moved swiftly over the next several decades to cap pension participation and transition to defined contribution plans. So how has that played out? Well, not well. Of course. I mean, it's all government controlled, socialized, and hiding from the tax man and all this kind of stuff. It's pretty rough. So not every American worker is offered a 401k or some sort of similar retirement plan through work, but of those who are, over 20% of them, over 1/5, over 1 out of 5 workers, they don't really want to participate. So as a result, 1 in 4 of Americans aged 45 to 64, and 22% of those 65 or older have $0 in retirement savings. 1 in 4 of people within 20 years of retirement, if you count it at 65, and almost a quarter or over 20% of those who are 65 or older have $0 in retirement savings. Almost half of American adults of all ages aren't saving anything for retirement. Just astounding. Just astounding. And it's pretty bad too, because the boomers were the product of a lot of fertility, a lot of kids being born, but they themselves had fewer children, which means that there's much less economic growth. Like, if you're going to invest in your economy, you need to have a bunch of kids, because that way future economic growth continues and maintains itself, which feeds your retirement income. But they didn't really get around to having too many kids, because I guess there were just too many fun things to do in the world. And that's pretty rough. So, for instance, for all workers 32 to 61, the average amount saved for retirement is less than $100,000, which is not nearly enough. And average savings now are actually lower than they were back in 2007, which of course means that this Great Recession, people are still not getting back on their feet from that. And remember, these numbers, it's an average, but there's a real bell curve, and the multi-million-dollar households bring up this average pretty dramatically. And that's pretty bad as a whole. Nearly half of families no retirement savings at all. Median values low for all age groups. So $480 for their families in their mid-30s to $17,000 for families approaching retirement in 2013. $17,000 for your retirement? For a family? Are you kidding? The 50th percentile household age, 56 to 61, has only $17,000 to retire on. And that's real close to the federal poverty level income for a family of 2 for just a single year. 1 year. Poverty level almost. And, of course, when you're young, as I know, a whole bunch of expenses you don't have to factor in. Healthcare costs in America are pretty high when you get older. Healthcare costs are driven up by a wild number of government controls and interferences in the market. So most planners will say save enough before retirement to maintain your annual living expenses about 70 to 80% of what they were during one's income earning years. Medicare out-of-pocket costs alone are expected to be between $240,000 and $430,000 over retirement for a 65-year-old couple retiring today. The gap between these retirement savings and living costs is huge. Nearly 83% of retired households have less saved than Medicare costs alone will consume. 1/3 of retired households are entirely dependent on Social Security. On average, that's only $1,230 a month, which is pretty hard to live on. 34% of older Americans depend on credit cards to pay for basic living expenses such as mortgage payments, groceries, and utilities. The Wall Street Journal reports that the current estimate of Medicare's unfunded liabilities now tops $42 trillion. Astonishing. Now, of course, there's a lot of denial in baby boomers. Boy, it's the first time they've ever come in contact with each other. Many of the boomers say, oh, I'm just going to work longer, and a growing percentage says, well, I'm just going to keep working forever. But you don't get to stay the same health that you always did. Health for you is like haircuts for me. It's diminishing over time. And so what happens is, because you get sick when you get older, or your health declines, you get arthritis, you get a bunch of stuff that is going to make it, or dementia or whatever, you have to leave the workforce, whether you want to or not. Half of current retirees had to leave the workforce sooner than desired due to health problems, disability, or layoffs. You may not have the choice. Now, also, of course, the Federal Reserve has basically had 0% interest rate policy forever. Supposedly to jumpstart the economy, it's really to prevent the government from having to pay too much in interest payments. And what that means is that even if you've saved up a bunch of money, you're hoping that compound interest, compound return is going to give you the money you need. But because the Federal Reserve has crushed a 0% interest rate policy, you're neutral or losing money on your savings, which is pretty rough. And the number of Americans aged 65 years and older is projected to more than double in the next 40 years. And there's no way I can imagine that the remaining body of active workers is going to be able to support this massive wave of underfunded seniors. Not going to happen. Not going to happen. It might actually happen if there wasn't all this massive third world immigration, but this massive third world immigration is further burdening the welfare system. It's further burdening the healthcare system and the school system and so on. And I don't know. I got to tell you, if you want taxes to be raised on the young to pay for your retirement, I think those young should probably be from your own country, your own culture. I don't know that a lot of Somalis are going to be very happy to have their wages suppressed, their taxes increased, even if they're working in order to pay for a bunch of old white and black people. I just don't really see how that's going to happen. But of course, I think that this is all to promote social conflict so that when the government can't pay its bills, they have a scapegoat as a whole. Now, of course, there are these people who worked for the government. And boy, you don't even get your pension. That's pretty rough because then you've had a crappy job for 30 years and you don't even get a great pension. But public pensions are vastly underfunded as well. I talked about this years and years ago. But of course, people don't listen. I talk and I talk and I talk. You listen, and I appreciate that, and please help out the show, freedomainradio.com/donate. But people as a whole don't listen, and therefore they must show up as an example of what happens when you don't listen. So the public pensions, they had assumptions, I'm going to earn 6% or 7% or sometimes even more. But the funds have not been managed very well. Of course, if you're really good at managing funds, you don't end up in a public pension. You go to Wall Street and make $1 billion. And of course, Federal Reserve 0% interest rate, a bunch of other reasons. Federal state pensions ridiculously undercapitalized. Like there's just no way. The total sum of unfunded public pension obligations went from $292 billion in 2007 to $1.9 trillion by the end of 2016. Let me just say that again because, dear God, that's staggering. Total sum of unfunded public pension obligations exploded from $292 billion in 2007 to $1.9 trillion by the end of 2016. Just astounding. There are, of course, Illinois, Kentucky, New Jersey, Dallas, Providence. State and local pension funds are failing on a regular basis. So, in my view, I remember this when I was in junior high school, of all places, junior high school. I remember a teacher telling us that we should rely on the government for our retirement. And I remember half the class just laughing. Like, give me a break, there's no conceivable. Because we were in a government program called education, so we just knew how terrible and bad it all was. So I've never thought of the government being around for my retirement at all. I mean, I'll work as long as I can because it's important what I do. But when it comes to retirement, you're on your own. That's the bad news. And there is stuff that you can do, of course. It'd be great if people had invested in Bitcoin when I was suggesting it. But there's a lot of stuff that you can do. But the first thing you need to do is recognize that what's being offered, what's being promised is not what's going to be delivered. Of course, it's the government. And it's a terrible thing. It's a terrible thing. And I don't know if it's a guy thing, like a male versus female thing. Because look at these fail videos on YouTube for an example. So in these fail videos, men crash into something and all the other men start laughing. I'm not saying it's great. I'm just saying it kind of happens. But when women fall, everyone's like, are you okay? And that's one of the main differences. If men fail, if men screw up, then other men in general, and sometimes women, will say, well, that's what you get for being dumb. That's what you get for believing things that aren't true. That's what you get for being an idiot. And there's not really as much sympathy. And yet for women, of course, a lot of times it's like, this poor person, this suffering person, they don't have enough to retire on and so on. It's like, well, maybe you should have planned ahead. Maybe you should have listened to people who were trying to tell you the right thing to do. Maybe you shouldn't have believed people who were obvious con artists and that work for the government. Come on, people. Let me give me a break. People are like, well, I paid into it. Well, people paid into Bernie Madoff's scheme as well. They don't all get their money back. And they had more reason to believe in Bernie Madoff than you have to believe in the government as a whole. So I think there's just this thing that as women have come more and more into public life, voting and public participation, and because they vote, they live longer, right? They vote more, and so politicians will respond more to female concerns than male concerns. First of all, the deal was, ladies, you got the vote, you were supposed to learn about politics and economics. Kind of that's the deal. And, ask your average woman about politics and economics, and you'll often get a glassy-eyed stare. So you kind of didn't keep up your end of the bargain, which is, sure, here's the vote. You can have a car, but you better learn how to drive. And you can have the vote, but you better learn about politics and economics. And I'm not really sure that happened quite as much as would have been optimal. And the second thing is, if you are a voter or just a human being, you have to be willing to let people fail. You have to be willing to let people fail and fail disastrously. It's an old demotivational poster that I remember looking at many, many years ago. And it really stuck with me. I mentioned it before. It's a super tanker or a ship going down like at 45 degrees. And underneath it said, it could be that the only purpose of your life is to serve as a warning to others. And men are willing to let people fail. And women seem to be less able to let people fail for a variety of reasons we could go into another time. But this inability to let people fail means we all get consumed by disaster.